Good evening, dear friends. This is an edited version of the lecture that I gave at the International Grail Conference in Dornach, Switzerland at Pentecost 2023. The original talk was in German, and I've changed the content slightly and shortened it for this English language video. The edited text of the German lecture will be available in the magazine Stil at Easter 2024, and you can subscribe to Stil by visiting the website at the Goetheanum. You can find that address on the section website, or simply Google Stil Magazine Goetheanum. At the beginning of my talk in Dornach, I made an important point. I said that I would speak as a poet and literary artist, rather than as a literary critic, professional anthroposophist, Germanist, etc. When I say that I approach the Grail as a poet, I mean that what interests me most about the Grail is its power to inspire poetry and its power to stimulate a friendly contest and conversation between poets. I use the word contest in the sense of a medieval joust, a contest in which poets challenge themselves, tradition, and other poets. The poets inspire and challenge each other, and the Grail literature grows and changes as a result. Now, it's important to keep in mind, I think, that legends of the Grail travel through time as secular entertainments, not as religious or esoteric teachings for a chosen few. The stories that have kept the Grail alive in our imaginations, these originated as sung, spoken, or written entertainments. In Rosicrucian terms, one might say that the Grail moves through time like a fairy tale sung or recited by poets or rhapsodes. The Grail legends contain many elements that have their origins in faraway places such as Persia, Egypt, India, but it is noteworthy that the golden age of European medieval Grail literature spans only about 50 years. The unfinished poem by Chrétien de Troyes, which inspired Wolfram and other poets, was written around 1180. Wolfram's much more extensive version, which completes and expands the themes and situations left unfinished by Chrétien, is dated to between 1200 and 1210. The Quest of the Holy Grail, that is to say, the French text that I will discuss in this talk, is dated to about 1225. The writing of these texts spanned a dynamic period of European history. These were the years of the Crusades, the years when the troubadours celebrated courtly love, the years when the cult of the Virgin dominated the religious imagination of Europe. It is also the time of heresies, inquisitions, and military aggressions. All these cultural, political, and religious energies flowed into the stories of the Grail, and the Grail became an ideal and symbol for what some persons have identified as a new civilization struggling to emerge in Europe around 1200. In my Dornach lecture, I discussed 3 examples of Grail literature. The first is the Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach. The second is the French story of Galahad, titled The Quest of the Holy Grail, which we find as the 6th part of the 7-part Lancelot Grail cycle, so-called. It is in this story that we first hear of Galahad. Now, this is the story that Thomas Malory adapted from the French, and it is the version that is still alive in the imagination of English-speaking readers. Thomas Malory was a night prisoner, a night in jail. He was apparently a scoundrel and reprobate, as well as a literary genius. But I guess you had to lock him up to get him to write. He wrote in prison, translating and editing tales from the French. Among these was the story of Galahad. Malory did not know Wolfram's Parzival. So Wolfram's Parzival and the story of Galahad, titled The Quest of the Holy Grail, are my two Grail stories. But then I introduced a third Grail story in my talk, and this came as a surprise to everyone, because I had not told anyone I was going to do this. My third poet was Novalis, and I talked about the character Heinrich from the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen, which is a novel that suggests how Grail literature moves forward from a narrow Christian religious medieval worldview into modernity and into a complex and human future. I then provided some North American context, since I have discovered over the years that some students of spiritual science have the idea that only Rudolf Steiner has talked about Parzival in a subtle, esoteric way, and that only folks who have gone through a Waldorf high school curriculum or a foundation year have been initiated into the mysteries of Parzival. So, I pointed out that the American Joseph Campbell celebrated Wolfram's poem extensively throughout the 20th century during his long career. And this included his series of popular televised interviews with Bill Moyers that brought Parzival into many American living rooms at the end of the 20th century. Campbell placed Wolfram on the same level as Homer, and that's very important. Campbell argued very convincingly that Wolfram's poem was a greater medieval masterpiece than Dante's Divine Comedy, and far more relevant to our contemporary world and its problems. Wolfram's poem is also indirectly known in the United States as Wagner's opera, I pointed out. But, as Joseph Campbell noted, Wagner's opera and Wolfram's poem are quite different. And this is a point I returned to a few times in my talk. I did this because the Grail Conference at Pentecost was scheduled at that time to balance the performance of Wagner's Parzival at the Goetheanum, the performance that occurred just a month earlier at Easter. Joseph Campbell was highly critical of Wagner's treatment of Wolfram's text. He felt that Wolfram's poem pointed to the future, whereas Wagner addressed the anxieties of Europe in the late 19th century, especially German anxieties. It's important to keep in mind, however, that Wagner had a very decisive interpretive impact on 19th century sensibilities and early 20th century sensibilities. Wagner was the all-important critical lens through which many people viewed and interpreted the Grail literature in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And this, of course, is the modernist period in which we situate anthroposophy in a literary sense. But from Joseph Campbell's point of view, Wagner took things in the wrong direction. Campbell read Parzival as a call to create a new mythology based on the freedom of the compassionate and ethical, spiritually striving individual. Such a reading has much in common with Novalis and other early Romantic poets who were searching for what they called a new mythology. We hear this ideal clearly at the end of Rudolf Steiner's Occult Science in Chapter 6. We see that from the fruits of the wisdom of the Grail springs the highest ideal of human evolution conceivable for the human being, spiritualization attained by the human being through her own efforts. Now, having gone this far, I then asked my listeners to pause for a moment to consider an important literary problem. When Rudolf Steiner mentions the Grail in Outline of Occult Science, he writes the word Grail. He does not write Holy Grail. But in the English-speaking world, the word Grail is often replaced willy-nilly by the term Holy Grail, as if Holy Grail and Grail were equivalent. Now, I might add that there's a similar confusion with the names Parsifal with a V, Wolfram, and Parsifal with an F, Wagner. Now, Wagner, as you know, concocted this Parsifal with an F spelling for his own artistic purposes, which is perfectly fine. Poets should take creative liberties. But what is not so fine is that naive readers do not distinguish between Wolfram's and Wagner's treatment of the theme. The assumption that Grail and Holy Grail are equivalent terms does not align with the historical literary facts. For example, Chrétien de Troyes, the first to write of the Grail in medieval literature, does not call the Grail holy. He calls it a Grail or the Grail. Indeed, scholars have long noted the ordinary matter-of-fact way in which Chrétien first introduces this mysterious and numinous object. And Wolfram von Eschenbach, as we know, refers to the Grail as a stone. Here, too, the word holy is missing. Wolfram's description of the Grail adds further layers to the mystery. For example, his stone could refer to the Islamic Kaaba, or to the philosopher's stone of alchemy. The stone is found as an archetype of the Great Mother in many pre-Christian mysteries and mythologies. Even more than Chrétien, who never completed his Grail story, Wolfram expanded his story to include the experiences of the Crusades. He added original characters such as Gomeret and Firefeast, and Wolfram's Parsifal contains elements from non-Christian cultures and non-Christian wisdom traditions. Wolfram was eclectic and comprehensive. Today, we would say that his outlook was global. So, how did this Grail, Holy Grail, confusion come about? It is the French author Robert de Boron who associates the Grail with the legend of Joseph of Arimathea. Robert tells us that the Grail was a bowl used for the Last Supper, and that Joseph of Arimathea used this Grail to catch the blood of Jesus. In the story, Christ tells Joseph that the Grail has a direct symbolic relationship with the wine cup of the Mass. The French story of Galahad, titled The Quest of the Holy Grail, that is to say, the story that I will discuss in this talk, that story shares ideas and themes with Robert. The two texts have combined the Grail story with content from Christian texts, such as the Gospel of Nicodemus. The 4th century Gospel of Nicodemus was very popular and widely distributed in the Middle Ages. And here begins the literary tradition of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which continues to our time. Now, from a non-literary perspective, you might think I am splitting hairs, but there are important reasons to discriminate. Unlike Wolfram's text, which is based on the courtly tradition of troubadours and minnesingers, the quest of the Holy Grail emerges as an independent work by an author who was quite active either as a monk or as a cleric. Unlike Wolfram, this unknown author was not a knight. He had no interest in celebrating the knightly tradition. Quite the contrary. This unknown author wrote a narrative that rejects many of the values that we find in the Parzival world. The hero Galahad is presented as a saint. Galahad is a freestanding literary invention by a poet with a very specific Christian religious imagination and with an agenda that aligns with Catholic theology. In keeping with this mood of Christian holiness and monastic discipline, chastity is celebrated as the highest spiritual virtue. We also see a very strictly enforced dualism between the worldly and the heavenly, similar to what we find in Christian dogma concerning the doctrine of original sin and the dogma of the impossibility of human redemption without the unmerited intercession of a God Savior and without an approved priestly ritual. In this Galahad story, chastity is the essential condition for beholding the Grail. And at the end of the book, the Grail leaves the world forever. Now, while Galahad is the hero who successfully completes the quest for the Holy Grail in that story, it is Galahad's father, Lancelot, who gives the story its emotional and poetic appeal. In fact, father and son have the same name because at his baptism, Lancelot was given the name Galahad. So father and son are mirror images of each other. Lancelot is the son of King Ban. When King Ban dies, his son is adopted by a fairy, the Lady of the Lake. The boy grows up in fairyland. He is taught and raised by fairies. He is given the name Lancelot du Lac and becomes the most famous knight in Christendom and the role model for the courtly lover. Lancelot is the father of Galahad because the Fisher King, here called Peleus in this story, the Fisher King played a trick on him. Lancelot, who is known to be in love, of course, with Queen Guinevere, is tricked by Peleus and a conspiring old woman into believing that Guinevere will spend a night with him in a love nest. Now Lancelot is confused with drugs and darkness, and he spends the night with the Fisher King's daughter Elaine instead of Guinevere. Now why did Peleus, the Fisher King, play this trick? Well, because, as in Wolfram's Parzival, bloodlines are very important. We are still in a feudal society where heredity and lineage determine destiny and opportunity. Even though Wolfram von Eschenbach celebrates Parzival's initiative and heroic stubbornness, his self-reliance, as Emerson might say, traits that lead him to defy God and force the hand of the Trinity, even though this is so, Parzival is ultimately recommended for the Grail because of his bloodline, and much attention is paid to his pedigree and to the status of his relatives. So, coming back to Galahad and the trick of the Fisher King, Peleus used this trick because the true Grail hero, Galahad, must be the descendant of two important bloodlines. One bloodline is descended from the Grail. The Fisher King, Peleus, was Galahad's grandfather, and Peleus' daughter, Elaine, was his mother. The other bloodline which descends from Lancelot, goes back to King David in the Old Testament. The search of the Holy Grail places Galahad in a similar bloodline to that which we find in the Gospel of Matthew, and this is the bloodline that Rudolf Steiner discussed in the lecture cycle that we studied during the last Holy Nights in the branch. I discussed this lecture cycle in a video that I shared a few months ago, and you can find this on the section website or on the YouTube channel. Galahad has a very close affinity with Jesus Christ. He arrives in Camelot on Pentecost. His name has an antecedent in the Old Testament. He is a saint without sin, and he lived in a nunnery until he was 15 years old. But once Galahad's quest for the Holy Grail is achieved, Galahad leaves the world, and society does not profit from his enlightenment. A captivating and almost hypnotic mood of renunciation and otherworldly piety characterizes this story of Galahad. One might say that it is music composed in a minor key, conveying a mood of longing and tension in its quest for redemption and absolution. This is indeed its literary strength. And Thomas Malory has recognized this mood and handled it splendidly in his narrative, as did Wagner in his music. And perhaps this mood of gloom and resignation is warranted. Historically, the age of medieval Grail literature and Camelot ends with the Inquisition. The Albigensian Crusade had begun when Wolfram wrote the poem Parsifal. The Christian Church had turned its crusading zeal upon itself, and the enemy other had now become Christian European heretics instead of Islamic infidels. In fact, there is indeed an argument to be made that Wolfram was reacting to this reign of terror, and that Pope Innocent III is the historical person whom Wolfram points to in the character of Klingsor. Now, this is important to consider. Recall that quote by Rudolf Steiner in Occult Science that I read earlier, or the quote by Joseph Campbell that I referenced. These two authors give us the impression that the orientation of the Grail literature looks to the future and to modernity. This spiritualization which the human being attains through her own work, outside the church or the community, is a heresy. But of course, from a poetic point of view, it is also a metamorphosis, that is to say, a change that reflects a change in the poetic consciousness of the human being and in the human identity. This is a change that Wolfram anticipates in his poem, and it is one important reason that Steiner devoted so much attention to the poem Parsifal. Now, although the end of the Galahad story is overshadowed by a mood of loss, abandonment, repression, and doom, there is little of this mood in Wolfram's Parsifal. Wolfram steers a course, as he tells us, exactly midway between the appeal of the spirit and the appeal of the flesh. He dances very carefully. Wolfram's poem celebrates spiritual and physical love, children and family. Wolfram has what we have learned to call a Shakespearean delight in puns and silliness and comic asides. He often acts like a stand-up comedian, using himself as a character to spice things up. His jokes and asides add an ironic perspective to the narrative. They wake up a sleepy or perhaps drunken audience. Wolfram extols masculine virtues and feminine sex appeal. He enjoys a good joke in bed and a lusty performance. His hero is a loving father and a skilled fighter. And his grail does not disappear from the world, leaving everyone lost, confused, and befuddled. No, he inspires a utopian society based on an ideal of ethical individualism, diversity, tolerance, and globalism. Wolfram reminds us that such a tolerant, all too human attitude leads us down the middle path, a path in the valley between the opposites of extremes. Such an attitude is characteristic of the consciousness soul, to use the familiar term from Rudolf Steiner. This is an attitude, that of the consciousness soul, that appreciates paradox, irony, ambiguity, and a tragic comic interplay of black and white. It is a mood of soul that appreciates gaps and which does not shy away from apparent contradictions. So, having gone this far in my talk, I then introduced the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen as a Grail text that speaks to this same mood of consciousness soul. And I argued that this novel by Novalis can be read in the spirit of Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival. Heinrich von Ofterdingen begins, as you probably know, with a famous dream, the dream of the blue flower. Significantly, Heinrich's mother wakes him up. She tells him that she wants to travel with him to her family. Heinrich has never seen his maternal grandfather, and the grandfather's court is famous for poetry and music. Now, our Grail hero, Heinrich, already feels like going on a quest. He wants to be a poet, but he doesn't know much about poetry yet. He is innocent and naive, and in many ways he is a fool, with the mind of a beginner. At the beginning of the book, you know he's still sleeping on a sofa every night in his parents' living room. He's very much a Parzival. So after a journey of several days and various initiations, Heinrich arrives at the grandfather's court with his mother, and he meets his grandfather for the first time. He also meets a master poet and initiate named Klingsorr. And he meets Klingsorr's daughter, Matilda, and falls in love with her and becomes engaged. Klingsorr initiates Heinrich into the art of poetry, and the initiation culminates when Klingsorr recites the fairy tale of Eros and Fable. This great fairy tale is a transformation of the Grail legend, and it is the climax of the first part of the novel. Heinrich becomes Klingsorr's lineage heir. Now, right away we should take note that Novalis sets his novel at the height of medieval Grail literature during the time of the Crusades. But although Novalis sets his novel in the time of the Grail literature and with reference to Wolfram, he challenges this Grail tradition, especially the tradition of the Holy Grail, in a significant way. For Novalis, poets are a metamorphosis of the old ideal of the Grail warrior, the elevation of poetry as a path to the Grail, under the sign of the blue flower, is a new challenge that Novalis poses to the Grail tradition. And as in Parzival, Novalis avoids direct reference to Christian rite or church. In this context, it should be remembered that in Wolfram's poem, many of the significant absolutions and confessions take place without a priest. But even if Wolfram can refer obliquely to the ideal of spiritualization which the human being attains through her own initiative, nevertheless, he has to be very careful. remember the Pelagian heresy and the Albigensian crusade. Wolfram certainly keeps that danger in mind. Therefore, he makes sure that Feirefies is baptized, and he has Trevisan admonish Parzival to respect the priesthood. Wolfram does not dare to question the power of the Church outright. But Novalis is a poet of the Reformation and the Enlightenment and a son of the age of revolution, and he lived in a safer time with more tolerant, secular, humanist literary values. He was a student of Schiller, and we friends and members of the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities should understand quite well what that means. We've talked about Schiller many times in our meetings, and about the friendship between Schiller and Goethe, and about the important texts that came about because of that friendship. And that would be the fairy tale of the green snake and beautiful lily. Now, this is a text that Rudolf Steiner called the germinal seed of the anthroposophical movement. And I take him at his word when he says that. According to Rudolf Steiner, anthroposophy arises from a literary moment. Now, we should note that Novalis assigns women and the feminine a very special role in his Grail story. Women are celebrated in Wolfram von Eschenbach's story, and of course in the Galahad story, women are idealized. But their role in these stories is to inspire bloody acts of male bravery or aggression, or to give advice or consolation. They have no real power unless they are allied with a male warrior. For example, a woman cannot be a knight on a quest. But one woman who does have power in the Parzival story is Kundry. but her power makes the men very nervous. Now, Kundry in Wagner is a variant of this literary type. Female sovereignty is very threatening to a medieval male hierarchy, and it is especially threatening to a medieval male clerical hierarchy, whether then or now, that emphasizes chastity, purity, and obedience, as we see, for example, in the Galahad story. Wolfram von Eschenbach places great emphasis on love in all its aspects, spiritual and physical. His poem is a cathedral of love, as Joseph Campbell liked to say. But in the Galahad story, this is certainly not the case. Here, the emphasis is on agape, not eros. Lancelot in this story, for example, Lancelot, the archetypal courtly lover, inspired by Eros, must atone and suffer for his sins of the flesh. He is defiled. He cannot attain the Grail. Now, from a mythological standpoint, this is an odd situation. Some might even call this a clear symptom of spiritual amnesia or spiritual dementia. In the context of the pre-Christian Grail legends, for example, in the Celtic world, the hero must establish a rightful relationship with a goddess to rejuvenate the wasteland and society. This female goddess of the fairyland or spirit world is called sovereignty. She is the ruling spirit or guardian of a particular landscape or a particular spring, countryside. The many Gothic cathedrals with the name Our Lady of this or Our Lady of that, these are subversive reminders of this pagan goddess tradition of sovereignty. Now, while the theme of sovereignty remains hidden in the Galahad poem, it is central in Parzival, and it is central in the Novalis novel as well. In Parzival, we see this theme In the various female characters that Parsifal encounters, and the adventures of Gawain in that poem, are another very important and visible, very visible reminder of this theme. Unfortunately, there is no medieval Grail story in which a young woman is the Grail heroine, and this is too bad, in my opinion. This means that we do not have a medieval masterpiece of the Grail that explores the Grail mystery from a female-feminine point of view. In medieval literature, much like the typical masculine male hero in a fairy tale, the male hero in those stories is searching for wholeness, for his lost or excluded feminine side. And when he finds this missing part, the male hero achieves wholeness. He gains the prerequisite to access a hidden spiritual realm. This spiritual realm has always already been there, present and accessible, but people do not see it. The hero encounters the excluded feminine in various disguises. The hero's relationship to sovereignty is of central importance. And what is his task? His task is to heal the condition of the wasteland, to overcome a condition of illness, social chaos, or spiritual dementia. In Novalis, the blue flower as a transformation of the Grail symbol inspires this great work of magical idealist alchemy. The striving of the Grail hero, male, for a rightful relationship with sovereignty, female, is always undertaken for only one overwhelming reason, so that a sterile wasteland might come to life again, rising in youthful splendor, like a phoenix from the ashes. Wolfram von Eschenbach, as well as Novalis, has created a hero whose achievements contrast startlingly with those of Galahad. And while the Galahad story emphasizes the religious devotion of the Christian world of the Middle Ages, Wolfram speaks to the future. We can read Parsifal as the first example of a modern spiritual biography, one might very well argue. Novalis and Wolfram are inspired by a common spiritual source, and this is the same source from which the tradition of secular humanist literature is nourished. And that is a tradition that is so vital to our section and its mission. So finally, to finish up, I took a very brief look at the fairy tale of Eros and Fable in Heinrich von Ofterdingen. It begins in a frozen world under the sign of Saturn, and recall the use of Saturn in the poem Parsifal. It ends with a Grail celebration of female sovereignty led by Sophie. That would be Sophie, not Sophia. Remember, names are important. A celebration that renews and rejuvenates the entire planet. In this Grail story, Sophie could be read as a transformation of Kundry. However, Kundry does not transform herself. No, rather, those who perceive Kundry as monstrous have transformed themselves and thus their perception. In the fairy tale of Eros and Fable, and that is Eros and Fable, not Agape and Fable, by the way, Sophie is the guardian of a Grail vessel on an altar. But it is not a Christian church altar. It is, however, a Grail vessel of renewal and regeneration. Under the care of Sophie, the vessel has the power to transform wisdom into love, or, as Rudolf Steiner, under the sign of the Grail, wrote at the end of the 6th chapter in Occult Science, wisdom is the necessary preliminary condition for love. Love is the fruit of wisdom reborn in the ego. We can compare this ending of the Klingsor fairy tale with Parsifal's second arrival at the Grail Castle. Only that in Klingsor's fairy tale, the role of the Grail Redeemer, so-called, is played by a little girl, Fable. Fable is another important and optimistic variation of the tradition by Novalis. Fable initiates the ritual of renewal, and Fable, as the name says, is the spirit of poetry, and a sacred wedding takes place, an alchemical wedding, and Sophie is whole and powerful and radiantly beautiful in her reign as a symbol of new sovereignty. Fable spins and sings. The kingdom of eternity is established. Love and peace have vanquished strife and war. The long dream of pain at last has vanished. Sophie is the heart's eternal priestess evermore. So I ended my talk with a question to the audience. In Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, the decisive dramatic moment takes place when Parsifal asks the question. My question was, can we find something similar in Heinrich von Ofterdingen? Is Novalis pointing to an important question? And my answer was yes. Novalis calls this question the secret word. He never tells us explicitly what this secret word means. But if we remember the words of Rudolf Steiner, we understand that this secret word implicitly refers to the Grail. The moment you ask, what is the secret word? At that moment, you have awakened spiritually in the Grail Castle. You have reached the moment when you can ask the important Grail question. So I ended my lecture now with a poem and with the question about the question and the secret word. And this short poem is the same one that I used in Manitoba to conclude my evening presentation. It's a short but very important verse, and I like to call attention to it whenever possible. This is the poem by Novalis that Rudolf Steiner read as the inaugural verse at the founding of the first Anthroposophical Society in Cologne, Germany, in December 1912. Recall that this was a very decisive historical moment in the history of anthroposophy, when the Theosophists who were students of Rudolf Steiner split from the Anglo-American Theosophical Society and renamed themselves Anthroposophists. Steiner read this poem by Novalis at this critical moment, and he called this short poem by Novalis, quote, the motto of the anthroposophical movement, unquote. Note that he said it's a motto for the movement, not for the society or societies. That's an important distinction, one might argue. Furthermore, at that time, and at nearly every critical moment in the history of the society, the societies, and the movement from about 1908 onward, Steiner directed his students to turn their attention to Novalis as one who lights the way for the anthroposophical movement or spiritual science. Under the sign of the Grail. This poem really deserves an evening lecture, and maybe we can do that sometime if conditions prove favorable. Here's the poem. When number, math, and figures are no longer keys to every creature, when those who sing and kiss know more than learned scientists, when the world takes joy to be alive, and in rejoicing breathes and thrives, when once more shadow and light espouse the birth of true insight. And in poetry and story, the human being grasps the world's eternal meaning. Then forth, before a secret word shall fly, that thing of falsehood, error, lies. Thank you for your attention and for your interest in the Grail and the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities, and for your interest in Novalis. And good night.